Hello, I'm Kathleen Olive. Welcome to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. The Naples Archaeological Museum's huge artwork, known as the Alexander Mosaic, is one of the most iconic ancient examples in this medium. A monumental work, it shows Greek and Persian forces, helmed respectively by Alexander the Great and his nemesis Darius, at a critical moment in one of their numerous military encounters. A dynamic composition made up of millions of tiny pieces of stone, it decorated the most prestigious house in all of Pompeii. It is also one of the most important meditations on conquest and violence to have come down to the Western art tradition. Dr. Mary Jane Cuyler, an archaeologist and Latin scholar, joins me to explain further. Mary Jane, thank you for talking to us today. You've chosen one of the most iconic, I think, ancient works of art, particularly in mosaic, that people would be able to call to mind. So can you introduce this work to us? What are you talking about today?
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I'm very excited to talk with you today about the Alexander Mosaic. The Alexander Mosaic comes from Pompeii. It is on display today and has been since the 1840s in the Archaeological Museum of Naples. And we are looking at a mosaic that's actually quite large. It's 5.31 meters wide and 3.13 meters tall. So it's a very big mosaic. And this is substantial because so much of it is figural, meaning that there are a lot of human figures and animal figures and not a whole lot of blank space.
And they're essentially, I mean, with those dimensions you've just described, we're essentially looking at figures who are kind of life size, close to life size.
Yes, they're smaller than life size, but yes, I'd say maybe 3/4 or half. They're quite big.
So, as you say, a huge kind of visual impact. When we visit the museum today, it's very kindly displayed for us on a wall, but that wasn't the original way that we would have seen this work?
No, in fact, it was on the floor. Now, there are wall mosaics. Wall mosaics absolutely exist. However, this was a floor mosaic. And when it was first displayed in the Archaeological Museum in the 1840s, when it was transferred over there, they displayed it on the floor. And then later, with a redesign, decided for the sake of all of us to put it on the wall. But it's interesting that it is displayed, or that it was ever a floor instead of a wall mosaic, simply because it's difficult to imagine taking in the scene from your feet, from looking down, because the scene is quite complex.
Yeah, it's very complex. And presumably, if that's covering a floor area of that size, there might be furniture or other things sitting on top of parts of this mosaic that would have made it harder to appreciate as you walked over it or stood over it. But the scene is so dramatic. What are we being invited to look at as we walk across this floor?
Let's move we'll move from left to right, but first we'll just talk about the overall scene that we're looking at. What we're seeing is an intensely dramatic, intensely violent scene of battle and warfare. Now, although some of the mosaic has been destroyed, and it was destroyed, in fact, in antiquity, we can get into where it was found and how it was found in a little bit. We can see much of the scene, and we can see, for example, if you look at just along the bottom, you can see discarded spears and bows and arrows, and the remnants of battle, things that have been dropped by fallen and dead soldiers. The scene, the actual battle scene that we're looking at, is between Alexander the Great and his companions. To the left, Alexander the Great being who would become the self-proclaimed king of Macedonia, which is an area of now recognized as part of northern Greece, but in antiquity, in the 4th century BC, was its own territory. And Alexander and his companions are battling against the King Darius, who was the king of Persia. And he was Darius III. He was, I think, the last Achaemenid king and a fierce warrior. There were several battles between Alexander and Darius, actually two that were the most important and decisive battles. And scholars argue over which one this could be. However, it is unlikely that it is meant to depict any particular battle, especially because, of course, narratives of battles are going to be given after the fact, and they're going to vary quite widely. What we do know is that we're at the moment where the battle is decisive, that Alexander is at the point of winning. How do we know this? So on the left, for those of you at home who are able to look at this and an image of this, which I very much hope you do, you can see Alexander. He is bareheaded. He's on his horse, Bucephalus, which means ox head. That's what he named his trusty steed. And you can see them, if you want to orient yourself, right below this leafless tree. It's the only natural part of the landscape that is shown in this mosaic. And he is facing toward a number of the Persians and possibly also Greeks, because in fact, Darius III had a number of Greek mercenaries in his army. And they are all pointing spears toward Alexander and his companions while they seem to be in the process of running away. So if you look closely at Alexander, he is bareheaded. Maybe he's just lost his helmet, or perhaps he is shown like this with his windswept hair, because this is how he's often depicted in statuary. Like when we see even contemporary imagery of Alexander, we very often see him with his loose flowing locks. So it may be just to give us a better look at his gorgeous head of hair. And he's looking wide-eyed and intensely toward Darius. And then on the right, we can see Darius. He is on a chariot that is led by, I think, pulled by probably it's supposed to be 4 horses, and he's being kind of pulled away from the scene. We know that he is meant to represent Darius, not only because we know that Alexander had a couple of very important pitched battles against him, but because of this cloth that he has over his head. If you look around, in fact, you'll see that the Persians who are being depicted with these cloths over their heads, you can see that the Persians are wearing these loose cloth caps. And in fact, these are known as tiaras, which is interesting. I mean, we think of tiara as a crown. In fact, Herodotus, who's, it was an ancient Greek historian, the father of ancient history, he's sometimes known as, he tells us that the Persians wore these things called tiaras. And the tall tiara, which probably was being held up by, the cloth is being held up by something that's sitting on top of Darius's head, is indicative of his royal status. You can also see that we're dealing with Persians because the guys on the right hand, where you can see their legs, they are actually wearing highly decorated trousers. Romans didn't wear trousers. And the fact Roman does come into play here because we're actually dealing with the Roman period space in which this mosaic was discovered. Greeks didn't wear trousers either. And I looked up the word for this. Like, what did they even call these pants that Greeks literally didn't have? And they had a Persian loan word. They borrowed a word from Persian for the word pants. It was anaxurides. Anaxurides is how they described the things that the guys put over their legs. Now, the scene of violence is very, very intense. We have below Darius, who is reaching out toward Alexander and looking toward him, even as his horses are pulling him and his chariot back in the other direction to escape the scene. You can see below him and his chariot, you can see actually the back of a horse. The horse is also like rushing, it's trying to rush out of the scene, and it's foreshortened almost perfectly because this entire scene actually looks like a painting and less like a mosaic. Below that horse and just to the right, it's a little bit damaged, but you can see that there's a shield and a face kind of staring out from the shield. And what this is there's a fallen soldier who's being crushed under or about to be crushed under the hooves of these stampeding horses, and he's staring into his own face at the moment of his own death. To the right of him, also beneath the hooves of the stampeding horses, you can see another soldier who's fallen, and he hasn't been crushed yet, but he's looking up, and it's absolutely imminent. And you can see his like fear and resignation in his eyes. Now, the entire scene is remarkable simply because it's so detailed and it's a mosaic.
And you said it looks, and I agree with you, when I look at this on the screen, even when I've stood in front of this, I have to remind myself, I have to come quite close to it to remind myself that it's a mosaic, that these are thousands of tiny tiles, which are allowing the artists who created this to give such an extraordinary range of tone and to give such a naturalistic effect to the scene. I mean, that reflection of the soldier in the shield before he's crushed to death that you've described. When you stand in front of this, I mean, it's such a vivid scene. You feel that you are there, you understand this, as you called it, extraordinarily violent moment. And yet someone's chosen this as decoration.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could tell us more. You said you could tell us more about where and how it was found. Could you tell us what kind of person has commissioned artists and artisans to make such a large scale and impactful work like this one?
Well, Kathleen, it was a very, very wealthy person. This mosaic was discovered in the 1830s in the wealthiest, perhaps the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest house of Pompeii. And this house is known as the House of the Faun. And it's called that because there was a bronze statue of actually not a faun, but a satyr found in the impluvium of this Roman house. And the house is filled with extraordinary mosaics. This one is by far the most extraordinary. Of course, this one it's unique among mosaics of the world. There's nothing quite like this one. But the house was importantly, essentially filled with antiques. Now, like everything else at Pompeii, it was destroyed in the eruption of 79. So this house was absolutely in use and occupied in 79 AD when Mount Vesuvius erupted and fossilized essentially Pompeii. But the house itself was not recently constructed. It hadn't been built even in the first century AD. The house was constructed in the early second century BC. And this mosaic, from various factors, have led archaeologists to conclude this mosaic was installed in the late second century BC or the early first century BC. So at the time of the destruction of the House of the Faun, the mosaic itself had been in place for about 180 years. And the other decorative elements of that house are also antiques. The painting style, the decorative style of the walls in the building are largely Pompeian first style, what is called the first style. So more of a style that evokes the first century, early first century BC, imitating marble and things like this. Very, very elegant stuff. So whoever commissioned it in the second century or first century BC, we have no idea of their identity. The question also, Kathleen, is whether it was commissioned at all, because some scholars have argued that it was brought over from somewhere else, that it was brought in pieces from, for example, Greece, which is a possibility, though these are just conjectures. There's, at this point, no way, either way, to prove whether this is the case. And there's also some problems when even talking about something like, oh, if the Romans had anything nice, they probably brought it from the Greeks, because this is an old idea that classical scholars have had around Rome, Rome being the gauche guys who were unable to or incapable of producing fine art. They had to get everything from the Greeks. But it's also possible that they did, in fact, just get this from the Greeks.
But the Greeks seem like a key point here, Mary Jane, because as you said, we're looking at a moment of conflict between Greeks and Persians, but you've just explained to us that this was found in a Roman house on the, peninsula of Italy. So if that has been brought over from Greece, or if it has been commissioned to a local Italian-based artisan, or an artisan from some other part of Rome's territory at that time, what kind of reasons would there be that someone would want to show this scene, have this scene in their house, even though they live in Italy and they're not Greek and they're not Persian?
Well, they could have been Greek. That's one possibility. But another possibility is, and I also invite our listeners to consider for themselves, because everybody can come up with some interesting ideas. Like let our imaginations roam. But one of the possibilities is simply that the legend of Alexander, his reputation was so impactful. He died at the age of 32, 33, already a legend, already a god. He was enormously important in the imaginations of subsequent rulers, and his imagery of his battles actually appear in a lot of different contexts. You see battles of Alexander, which he had many, battles of Alexander depicted on sarcophaguses. You see wonderful battle scenes depicted on vase paintings from pottery from Apulia, from southern Italy. So the imagery of Alexander and his different battles was important in the larger Mediterranean culture. The other thing to think about, and this may or may not be very crucial, but Alexander's first battle against Darius, which was in like 333 BC, the Battle of Issos, this was a watershed moment for him, because prior to the first battle that he had against Darius, who was a very, very important Persian king, Alexander didn't go about calling himself a king. It wasn't until after the first defeat against Darius's army that he starts being referred to and calling himself a king. And so this could also be presumably a powerful message about success or transformation. Though perhaps maybe I'm taking that a little bit too far.
You're describing a really interesting culture, though, that this mosaic was created into, or at the very least, kind of inserted into in the 2nd century BC, when it becomes part of the House of the Faun in Pompeii, this vogue for Alexander and the conquests of Alexander, and maybe, as you're suggesting, maybe also an attempt to kind of associate oneself and one's own success with this possibly, if that's what we're looking at, possibly kind of career-defining, king-making moment for Alexander himself. But what have been the, maybe by way of conclusion, what have been the modern fortunes of this mosaic since it was excavated in Pompeii? How has it been understood more recently?
Honestly, a lot of the discussions around this mosaic surround, first of all, what battle it represents. I follow Ada Cohen's interpretation that it is very likely a conglomeration or a combination of at least two battles. Other conversations are around the destruction, areas of destruction on the mosaic, and whether they represent areas, for example, where people might have been standing. Although it's also quite possible that the mosaic was destroyed by previous earthquakes, and they were working like in the process of fixing it up a little bit. And the very, very most recent, we're talking published January of 2025, research started in 2020 when a group of Italians, mainly scientists, subjected this mosaic to a lot of analysis to figure out where the different stones may have come from, the different marble that comprise the mosaic. There are actually millions, literally millions of tesserae comprising this mosaic. I have not found a number that tells us how many, nobody has counted them. I have seen 1,200,000. I have seen 4 million. There are literally millions of teeny tiny pieces put together in something called opus vermiculatum, which means worm-like pattern to give you that paint effect. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, because they couldn't take the individual examples and destroy them to find out their composition, they're still stuck with some guesses, but quite a number of the marbles that are represented in this mosaic, from what I could see, quite a number of them came from Italy. But that does not necessarily mean that it was made in Italy, because of course the Greeks had the ability to import different colors of marble to Greece.
So you've described for us a kind of modern reception of this artwork in which being able to pin down some more of its historical specificity is really a kind of an overwhelming concern. And yet, I think for many of us, when we stand in front of it in the Archaeological Museum in Naples, instead we start thinking about other great battle scenes that have followed this, that, you know, are called to mind for us by the kind of virtuoso of this. So I think, for example, of very famous battle scenes by Paolo Uccello, a 15th century Italian Renaissance painting, or I think of Velázquez's The Lancers, which is another, you know, really key kind of military scene of his. It's the visual impact of this that's overwhelming for me. So perhaps to bring us to a conclusion, can you just tell us something about what it is that arrests you when you look at this mosaic?
What arrests me when I look at this mosaic is the incredible detail actually of the horses and the very precise rendering of their body language, the body language actually of the horses, as one of them's falling, one of them's moving away, and one of them's running. And if you look at the way that everybody's costumes, or not costumes, their clothing and their armor is depicted, what strikes me is the sense of realism. Now, Kathleen, you were just describing some other battle imagery that necessarily could not have been inspired by this particular scene, right? Because this was not discovered until the 1830s, and even then wouldn't have been widely reproduced yet. And so what I believe we're seeing is, with this level of detail of the pandemonium, the chaos, the death, and even the detail of the horses, is there's a verisimilitude. We are looking at a battle. And the people, many of the people who would have visited the house of the faun, would have also, the men at least, have themselves participated in battle. And there would have been aspects of this scene that would speak to them. It would be telling their own story or stories of their own experiences and things that they themselves have seen.
And isn't that the power of a great artwork like this one, to be able to reflect back something to us that we already know, but give us a different way of understanding something that's actually akin to experiences that we have had, representing that to us in different ways. So thank you so much, Mary Jane.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.